question we're going to explore will center on the idea of criminal justice and restitution, which basically means this. If somebody's done something criminal, is the objective of the justice system to make sure that they are punished, or to make sure that the victim is appropriately compensated? Now think about that. Let's say, for argument's sake, that, God forbid, somebody damaged your property or stole something from you. Are you most interested in the fact that they'll be thrown into prison, or are you most interested in the fact that you're going to get repaid for the damage that was done? It's an interesting conversation, right? And it sits at the heart of quite a lot of the discussion around what the objective, what the goal of the criminal justice system should be. Now, we're going to get to that later. We're not going to deal with that immediately. But there's an area in the Jewish experience and in Jewish history that really speaks to the heart of this issue. And part of that discussion emerges in this week's parasha. Because in this week's parasha, we've got the moment at the burning bush where Hashem tells Moshe what the plan is. You're going to go to Egypt. You're going to confront Pharaoh. You're going to tell him to let the Jewish people go. He's going to refuse. I'm going to bring plagues. And then eventually the time will come where there'll be a tipping point and the Egyptians will, or Pharaoh will acknowledge that they have to let the Jews go. And that's essentially the promise that he's given, the promise of the Exodus. There's one line in all of that which kind of leaps out at you because it doesn't seem to fit. And before we discuss what that line is, let's just step out for a moment. Imagine you are Moshe, which means you're now going to become that individual who has the tremendous privilege of taking the Jews out of Egypt after 210 years of intense slavery. What's on your mind? What are you thinking about? You've been told, besides all the back and forth where Moshe says, I don't know if I'm the right person for the job and maybe you should choose somebody else. Leave all of that aside. The message is, this is the moment they've been waiting for generations. They are going to leave Egypt. You expect, firstly, in Moshe's mind, and secondly, in the mind of the Jewish people as a whole, that is very big news. And surely that's what's going to capture their attention, and that's what they're going to care about. We're going out of Egypt. The details are not necessarily going to be that important. Surely. The main thing is, we're going out. The one burning question that everybody's going to care about is, when is this going to happen? How soon is it going to happen? We've heard promises before, or whatever's going through their mind. But there's a detail that leaps out at you because Hashem chooses to include this detail in the conversation, and you have to wonder why. So that's what Hashem says. When that time comes, and the Jews are going to leave Egypt, I promise you, V'nosati eschein ha'am hazeh be'enei Mitzrayim. You know what chen is? Everybody knows what chen is. Chen is favor or grace or charm. So Hashem tells Moshe, when that time comes that the Jews are going to leave Egypt, I'm going to ensure that they have a certain charm in the eyes of the Egyptians. And as a result of that, they're going to be able to get from the Egyptians gold and silver and fancy clothing, etc., that they'll take with them as part of the, if you wish, severance package that they're going to get when they leave Egypt. And that seems out of place. Why is that an issue? Surely the key issue over here is they're going to get out of Egypt. They're going to be freed. They have been slaves, and now they're going to be freed. Surely that's the main issue. Why do we have to have this detail that the Egyptians are going to look at them graciously and that they're going to give them all of this great wealth? Now, if you step out of the conversation for just a moment and think about human psychology. Do you remember there was once something, I think they did it in the 70s, called the marshmallow experiment? Remember this? So the marshmallow experiment was essentially an experiment to see how children would deal with delayed gratification. So the idea is that you've got these preschool children and they put a marshmallow in front of them and they say, you have two choices. Either we're going to go out the room, either you eat the marshmallow or you wait and then in 15 minutes we'll come back, and if you haven't eaten the marshmallow, we're going to give you 2 marshmallows. And it's this whole study in the capacity for people to delay gratification. And then they traced how these people behaved as they grew up, and they found that those who were able to have that self-control, they typically went off to become great leaders and academics and so on and so forth, because there is this value in delayed gratification. Okay, that makes sense. But now we're going to take a different version of the marshmallow experiment, completely different version. This version says, we're going to abduct you, lock you away in a cell, deprive you of normal human rights and sunlight and human contact. And then we're going to, after 30 days of doing this, we're going to say to you, what would you prefer? Would you prefer to go home today? Or would you prefer to have another 30 days of this? And then at the end, we'll give you $50,000. So all of us sitting comfortably here might think, you know what, the money sounds lucrative. But once a person's been in that isolated environment for 30 days, the average human, healthy human being is going to say, I don't care about the money. Let me out of here. So surely there's the same kind of psychology going on over here. Moshe is getting a message from Hashem to take back to the Jewish people. And the message is going to be, listen, the end is nigh, so don't worry, you're going to get out of Egypt. But it's not happening immediately, because we have to work to a point where the Egyptians look at you graciously and then give you a whole lot of money. You can assume that the average healthy Jewish person is going to say, skip the money and let us go home today. It's been long enough, we've suffered enough, we've lost enough people. We don't need the extra money. And yet, Hashem seems to build this in as a key aspect of the experience of what it means to leave Egypt. Because think about it. At this point, Moshe is still in Midian, which is where he had escaped. Remember, there was a story, Pharaoh wanted to kill him. He escaped to Midian and he set up a family there. He built a life over there. The burning bush happens in Midian. Moshe has not yet taken one step in the direction of going to confront Pharaoh. They haven't begun the process of informing the Jews that they're going to leave Egypt. They haven't begun the plagues. None of this has happened. Why is it so important at this point, before the mission begins, to say, and a big part of this mission is that the Egyptians will look at you favorably, and you will end up getting all this great wealth from them before you leave Egypt. Any thinking person, Moshe included, would have said, you know what, that's really nice, but let's leave that alone and just get them out. This is an emergency. We have an opportunity to rescue the hostages. Let's get them out without negotiating what kind of package they're going to have. So the Midrash addresses this. The Midrash on this week's parasha, on this verse, where he says, I will give you favor in the eyes of the Egyptians. And the Midrash says this. Hashem wanted to ensure that when the Jews would leave Egypt, they would leave laden with resources, with wealth, because Hashem did not want to have a situation, listen to the words, he didn't want to have a situation where Abraham, their forefather, would be able to complain. The words that the Midrash use are pischoin peh, that he'd have a reason to open his mouth in protest. And his protest would have been as follows. This story of the Egyptian exile did not begin at this point. In fact, it didn't even begin when Yaakov and his family went down to Egypt because they discovered that Joseph was living there. This story began generations earlier, where Hashem makes a covenant with Avraham. It's called the Bris Bein HaBesarim, the covenant between the parts. And it's basically at that point where he commits to the fact that your children are going to become a special nation, and they're going to have this unique relationship with me, etc., etc. It's in that covenant that Hashem promises Avraham that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, and the people in that land will oppress them. And he gives a time frame that it's going to be for 400 years. And then we discover afterwards that he actually eased that and said we'll count from the time that Yitzchak is born, and they're only going to spend 210 years actually as slaves. And then he says these words, V'gam es hagoy asher yavodu don anoichi. Eventually, I'm going to judge, which implies that I'm going to punish the nation that oppresses them. And after that, the Jewish nation will leave Egypt with tremendous wealth. So the Midrash says, Hashem doesn't want a scenario where Abraham is going to turn to Hashem and say, okay, so there were two parts to this covenant that you made with me. The first part was that the Jews would be slaves for a long period of time in a foreign environment where they would be oppressed. And that part of the promise you kept, because look, the Jews have been slaves for 200 years. But the second part of your promise was that afterwards they would leave with great wealth. What happened to that part of the promise? So the Midrash says that's why even before Hashem sends Moshe to confront Pharaoh, he has to clarify what's going to happen in terms of fulfilling his promise. His promise is that they're going to emerge with a lot of wealth. He needs to tell him that promise is going to be fulfilled. How's it going to be fulfilled? Well, the Egyptians are going to completely change their tune, and instead of being these aggressive taskmasters, they're actually going to look favorably at the Jewish people, and therefore the Jewish people are going to leave with all this wealth. Now Abraham has no complaints against me. Okay? Again, it goes back to that original question about human psychology. Well, what would you prefer? An earlier exit without the money, or would you prefer the money? And then the question is, so Hashem made this promise to Abraham, but Abraham surely cares about his children. So surely he cares about the fact that they should spend as little time as possible as slaves, even if it means they're not going to get that big money at the end. On the other hand, Hashem's made a promise. And clearly a promise has to be fulfilled. So clearly that's what's going on over here, that the Midrash is telling us, Hashem is telling Moshe, I have to keep my word. I promise that they're going to have wealth, so they're going to have wealth, and this is how it's going to happen. Now the Midrash is not the only source that discusses this. There's a very similar discussion that happens in the Gemara. Except the Gemara does not discuss it in the context of this parasha, where Hashem tells Moshe about his mission. Rather, the Gemara discusses it when it actually happens. So fast forward towards the end of the story, and towards the end of the story you have the second last plague, which is the plague of darkness. And then after the plague of darkness, the Jews are going to leave at the time of the plague of the firstborns. So it's in that context that Hashem tells Moshe to tell the Jewish people, Daber na, please speak to the Jewish people and tell them that in advance of the plague of the firstborns, I want them to do two things. During the plague of darkness, I want them to go into the Egyptian homes and see what assets they have. And then when it's time for the plague of the firstborns and they're going to leave Egypt, then I want them to go to their neighbors and please ask their neighbors to give them gold and silver and the various other resources that they're going to take out of Egypt. So the Gemara there picks up on the fact that Hashem says please, which is very unusual. Right? Normally Hashem says this is what you've got to do. But here Hashem says please. So the Gemara says the reason that Hashem is saying please is saying please make sure that the Jews go to their Egyptian neighbors and they get that wealth, because I don't want, listen to how the Gemara says it, I don't want that tzaddik. It doesn't tell us which tzaddik. We have to know the background. We have to know the context. I don't want that tzaddik to complain that I fulfilled the part of the promise to enslave them, and I did not fulfill the part of the promise to give them wealth. So the Gemara is basically saying the same thing, right? That the reason that the money becomes such a big part of this conversation is because that is the promise that Hashem made to Abraham, that there'd be two stages to the experience. The first stage of the experience is that there'd be slaves. The second stage is that they'd have wealth. And we don't want Abraham to turn around and say, well, you made the slavery happen, you didn't make the wealth happen, so please make sure that they ask for the money from the Egyptians. Okay, so pretty clear, right? Pretty clear what the theme is. Hashem has made a promise, and Hashem has to keep the promise. So now the question really is, what is the nature of this promise? What did Hashem promise the Jews? Or, more correctly, what did Hashem promise Avraham that would happen to the Jews? So it seems quite simple, right? He promised him two things. He promised him that they would suffer as slaves, and we could leave that for another conversation, or for a later part of this conversation, why that had to happen, but that's part of the promise. And the second part of the promise is that afterwards, afterwards, Yetzu Berechush Gadol, they will emerge with great wealth. So let me ask you this question. If there's a promise from Hashem that the Jews after the slavery are going to be very wealthy, would you agree that there are many ways that that could have happened? Meaning, the promise is they will be wealthy. Nobody said that that wealth has to necessarily come from the Egyptians. Hashem could have done, I don't know what. He could have led them to a different part of the Middle East and they could have found oil. I don't know what he could have done. Hashem could have made sure that as soon as the Jews left Egypt, there was a financial opportunity that arose that made them the wealthiest people on earth. I'll take it even a step further. Let's assume, for whatever reason, that the money the Jews had to gain had to come from Egypt. Let's just assume. Even that Hashem could have orchestrated in a whole lot of different ways. For example, if they were already going through the Egyptians' homes during the plague of darkness, Hashem could have just told them, take the stuff while you're in their homes. I know that feels a little bit uncomfortable for us because it doesn't feel all that legal, but at the end of the day, if that's what Hashem tells you to do, then it's obviously above board. Or Hashem could have made one of the plagues that all of the Egyptians die, and now all of their resources are there for the picking, and whoever gets them, and obviously the Jews are the people who are there, so they could take all of that gold and silver, etc. And I'm sure if you thought about it, you could come up with dozens of other scenarios where Hashem could have ensured that the Jewish people would be wealthy after having gone through the experience of the slavery, right?
Are we expected to assume that Hashem was talking about material wealth?
Okay, that's a very good question. And let's assume that he was not talking about material wealth. Then that only makes the question stronger, because then what do we need to go through this whole process where you have to be, so to speak, find favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and then they have to give you their stuff. If it's not physical wealth, then surely it must be a much easier process. So why do we need all of these steps? What's going to sit at the heart of this conversation is to analyze, like I said at the beginning, what is considered to be justice. Is justice purely compensating a victim, or is justice making the perpetrator feel the pinch? So let's think about this in practical terms. What would happen if we had an incredibly wealthy person, a big philanthropist, who set up a fund, and that fund would compensate anybody who was a victim of crime? Okay, let's just say that that was the case. So a guy breaks into somebody's house, steals a whole lot of things. You now go to this, that person goes to this fund, puts in a claim, and says, look, terrible thing happened to me. I was robbed. And they say, no problem. Just give us the whatever evidence is required that this is what happened. And then you get a payout. Would the victim feel satisfied? In other words, I got compensation for what I lost. Would the victim feel satisfied? And the second question is, would justice have been served? And the third, not question, but observation is, if we did something like this, would we in any way tackle crime? Because effectively all we're doing right now is making sure that the person who's on the receiving end is not out of pocket. But the criminal is essentially running free and doesn't feel any sense of responsibility or consequences. So I think we'd all agree that that's a nice gesture on behalf of this philanthropist, but it's not really good for society. I think we'll all acknowledge that in the nature of the justice system, in order for a society to be a healthy society, there have to be two sides of the coin. On the one hand, we have to look to compensate a victim of crime, and on the other hand, we have to look to punish the perpetrator of crime, surely. Now that's going to feed into this conversation. The question is here, the fact that the Jews will be wealthy when they leave Egypt, is that because we need Egypt to suffer the pain of what they did to the Jewish people, so therefore they have to lose all of their wealth? Because look how they abused the Jewish people over all these years. So now something's going to happen to them. They've got to feel the pinch. There has to be a consequence. So we need to punish the Egyptians and make them lose their wealth. Or is the focus over here that the Jews have suffered for so long, and we have to make sure that they are compensated for what happened to them? And effectively, if you have a look at the various insights and commentators on the parasha and on the story of the Exodus from Egypt, you're going to pretty much find that there are these two sides to the argument. Even if you look at the verse, when Hashem was speaking to Abraham and telling him about what was going to happen to his children, he said, he said clearly, the nation who's going to subjugate them, I'm going to judge and I'm going to punish. That tells you clearly that Hashem's intention is that the Egyptians have to, in some way, face consequences. And then in that same sentence he says, and after that the Jews will leave with great wealth. So it sounds like, again, the verse is saying, I'm going to judge the perpetrators and the Jews are going to leave with great wealth. It sounds in the verse like the goal is to punish the Egyptians. So we've got to take their wealth away. Now that we're taking their wealth away, we've got to decide, who do we give it to? Oh, who do we give it to? Well, in that case, the best people to receive it would be the Jews because they were the victims. But the goal is punish the Egyptians. Or do we say, the most important thing that has to happen over here is the Jewish people have to be compensated because they suffered for 200 years. Unjustly, actually. So they have to be compensated. Okay, now we have to compensate the Jews. Where are we going to get the resources from to compensate the Jews? Well, listen, the Egyptians were bad guys, so let's take their stuff. And so those are really the two sides of the argument over here. Which are we going to prioritize? Are we going to prioritize the fact that we are smiting the Egyptians and the Jews just happen to benefit? Or are we focused on the fact that the Jews are the ones who need to benefit, and it just so happens that the Egyptians are the people who are, so to speak, best positioned to provide the compensation to the Jews? Now, in exploring this question, we're going to discover, not today, but as we continue, please God, we're going to discover that what lies at the core of this issue is not just simply how justice is best served, but what's going to lie at the core of this is, what is the experience of Egypt going to have been? And that's why Abraham, who is the father of the Jewish people, who obviously cares about the Jewish people, and obviously cares about the experience that they're going to have and why they went down to Egypt, he's going to want this to play out in a very specific way, where it's not going to be good enough just to have cash in the bank because you went through something difficult. He's going to want it to work in the way that is the best outcome for the Jewish people. So we've got two scenarios. The one is that we're hammering the Egyptians and the Jews happen to benefit. The other is we're helping the Jews and the Egyptians happen to suffer. One of those two scenarios is going to be the one that Abraham cares about the most. And so that's why he has to be satisfied in the way that Hashem makes this whole thing play out. And it's not going to be just good enough to say they have wealth. It's going to be a question of, how did they get that wealth? Does it satisfy what Abraham needs to happen to his children? So based on that, we'll actually, we'll explore which one Abraham is looking for, and then based on that, we'll understand what the entire spiritual backstory of the Egyptian experience was supposed to be, which we'll continue, please God, tomorrow.